Welcome to Sigest, your fortnightly serving of digestible science from plant and food research.
Tēnā koutou katoa and welcome to Sigest. Well, today's guest is clearly someone who enjoys a challenge. Dr. James Sainsbury isn't content with wrangling bees as leader of the bee biology and productivity team. He's also plunged into the hornet's nest, which is local body politics. In this edition of Sigest, we're going to follow the twists and turns of James's career, from infectious diseases right up to the beguiling world of bees. It's going to be an interesting ride. Kia ora, James, and welcome to Sigest.
Kia ora, good morning, Andrew.
It's great to have you here. Let's start with James Sainsbury, the current edition. Can you tell us a little bit about your role as team leader for the bee biology and productivity team?
Absolutely. Team leader for the bee biology and productivity team. And in the team, we've got 3 scientists, including myself, 2 research associates, and between 2 and 5 graduate students / summer students / casual employees helping us progress the science. And the mission is the use of science to maximise the value of bees for New Zealand. So in light of that, at any one time, we'll have research projects, some of which are very sort of prescriptive, fee-for-service type, manufacture this data set, through to some very basic fundamental science and everything in between.
So are you mostly focused on the making of the honey side or the pollination side?
Good question. So a lot of our work focuses on honeybees, but bumblebees and native bees are also on our radar. And honey is always front of mind in New Zealand with Manuka honey and other high-value honeys, but a really interesting part and where there's a lot of work to do is in the pollination space. So it's this idea of, how to package bees to deliver maximum pollination in growing environments, including these increasingly changing environments and increasingly changing climates and all of those challenges that are up ahead of us.
Which kind of brings me quite nicely to the next question. We hear a lot about declining bee numbers worldwide. Is this a big problem in New Zealand as well?
So there's hundreds of thousands of registered beehives in New Zealand, and we can produce more and have more if we want them. The challenge is that there's this horrible little pest, varroa mite, which are in every single beehive in New Zealand except on the Chatham Islands, and the honeybees need humans to manage that on their behalf. So beekeepers need to go in and treat varroa at least a couple of times a year. So it's easy enough to have plenty of honeybees, but it's that vulnerability of they rely on humans to help manage varroa, and we, of course, rely on a suite of interventions to manage varroa. So that's where the vulnerability is.
So with interventions, how's it normally managed? So
the primary way of managing varroa in New Zealand is the use of synthetic chemicals, which have served the industry exceptionally well, but much like antibiotics, which tend to develop resistance over time to the things we're trying to treat, that sort of thing has happened elsewhere in the world. So we are looking for new ways to manage varroa, and there's some really great research projects underway in the team actually that look at that.
What does it actually do to the bees?
It's a parasite, so it feeds off the honeybee, the immature bee in particular, and that's not good for anybody. But it also transmits diseases and viruses and is an incubator for some of the viruses as well. So it just makes affects the whole ecosystem of the hive, and they don't tend to do very well. And if a colony is not treated, they typically peter out after about 18 months.
So I just think bees are kind of pretty hot at the moment. You think about people that have urban hives, and you just mentioned Manuka honey before. Why do you think that is? Why do you think humans are so drawn to bees?
Oh God, they're just so charismatic, right? I think it's this idea that there's this community that's working together and appeals to a lot of people. If you select your bees carefully, they are nice and docile, they can sting you, but they really don't want to. And then they produce something delicious and support our food supply. So what's not to like?
Yeah, what's not to like? I think that's something that really engages with a lot of people. It's interesting. Okay, so let's get back to your life. Let's get away from the bees for a second. Let's wind the clock back to New Zealand, 1992. Petrol's $1.84 a litre. Billy Ray Cyrus's achy breaky heart is in the top 10 for far too long, and you're studying at Matamata College. What was your school like for you?
Good. It was wonderful. At the time, you don't really think much of it, but thinking back, I was very lucky to have a range of very good teachers, very supportive, a good school, supportive cohort, I guess, that I was going through school with. So, very lucky on all those fronts.
And did you gravitate towards like the sciences early on in school, or were you kind of focused on other stuff?
Broad, I would say. I'd say. But again, teachers, looking back, teachers have an influence, even if we don't realise it at the time. And again, very good and engaging science teachers.
So did you think then that you'd end up in science, or did you have other aspirations in terms of what you wanted to do?
I can't imagine I was that focused at that stage in terms of the career path.
Like most teenage boys.
It was definitely an option, but I don't recall being focused in that way.
Don't recall having that, other things on your mind when that age, I imagine. Okay, so tell me a little bit about your PhD then, which is at Victoria University, is that
That's right?
Yeah, okay, about what you were studying there.
So went to Victoria University where I did my degree in honours and then went on to a PhD. And it was looking at the population genetics of the native forest parrot kaka using microsatellites, which in those days was just cutting edge. It was just at the beginning of the omics era, I guess. And we were looking at essentially the population structure. So it was first of all characterising the microsatellites, which is...
Can I just ask you to give a little definition of a microsatellite for people who are non-genetic?
A microsatellite is a repeating piece of DNA, and they are very common, don't appear to have a function that we understand, but they're also highly variable. If you look at microsatellites, you tend to pick up a lot of variability, and you can also do that in quite a low-tech way. So in a university lab in the 90s, early 2000s, it was something that was quite accessible. And so if you can understand genetic variation, then you can understand how individuals are related to each other and how populations are related to each other. And we were interested in kaka populations throughout the country and how they were related to each other on the North Island and the South Island. And the view was having that information to help support conservation efforts. So amongst other things, if birds are translocated, it's usually helpful to make sure that they're translocated within the same species or subspecies or whatever that looks like. So that was the information we were hoping to generate.
Yeah. And just as those who don't know, kaka is like the green parrot of New Zealand, right? The native green parrot.
So it's close relative as the kea. So the kea lives in the alpine regions, and then the kaka live in forests. And they're quite large, very charismatic, quite long-lived. And they respond really well to predator-proof fencing. So when I was at Victoria Zealandia, which is the conservation park there, was just getting started, and they introduced about 6 pairs of kaka there, and I was one of the volunteers that fed them. And then I went back about a year ago, and these kaka are just everywhere, ripping to pieces people's gardens. So they respond really well to conservation efforts. And actually you see them a lot more frequently now than you did 20 years ago.
Yeah, I went to a friend's place in Wellington, and there was one sitting in their back garden. Couldn't believe it. That's just, in suburban Wellington.
It's amazing to see.
So it must be pretty cool to have worked on something like that. So after the PhD, you worked at a very intriguing place, didn't you? London Zoo. Is it as amazing as it sounds having an opportunity there?
Absolutely. So finished my PhD, went to the UK and did a few odd jobs, but ended up getting a job at the Institute of Zoology, which is a little tiny research institute attached to the London Zoo. So it's in the grounds there on the banks of Regent's Canal, and all sorts of focuses there. And this is where I started working on bumblebees. So they had a project to work on bumblebee population dynamics in the UK, and there's all sorts of different bumblebees in the UK, and British people love them, and they're actually a protected and endangered species there, so a slightly different mindset. And it was about looking at how land use changes were affecting population levels of bumblebees, and then the consequence of that on pollination of commercial crops. So again, it was like genetics based was the contribution that I was making.
Yeah. So the problem with bumblebees in the UK is they're basically getting killed by a lot of the pesticides being used, or why do they know why the numbers are declining?
I'm sure there's lots of factors. The thing that we were, sort of the area that I was working in was around hedgerows and hedgerow removal. So bumblebees nest in leaf litter and things like that. And so hedgerows were a perfect place for bumblebees to nest. And as those were removed to sort of have bigger fields that were easier to plough and all of that sort of stuff, the areas of land where bumblebees could reproduce was reduced, with consequences therein. And so the idea was that if farmers left strips of wildflowers around their canola crops or whatever, would that increase bumblebee levels and increase pollination downstream? And so we were testing some of those ideas.
Cool. Very technical question. Can bumblebees sting you?
Yes, they can. They can. They don't have a barb on the sting, though. So honeybees can sting you and they sting you once, whereas bumblebees can sting you as many times as they want.
Okay, good to know. So there's always been a bit of debate about that in the office, so I can now say I've got some authoritative advice on it. Okay, so now after that, quite a big shift, both physically and scientifically, with doing a postdoc in Canada. How did that involve? Because it was again, a completely different area for you, right?
So again, it was genetics. It was the DNA, which is common to all life. And so this was with the University of Manitoba in Winnipeg, in the middle of the country. And the university has a long-term relationship with the University of Nairobi in Kenya. And the research program is around a group of commercial sex workers in Nairobi. And commercial sex work in that environment is very high risk, as you can imagine, where the women are exposed to HIV basically every day. And most women that enter that environment would become HIV very, very quickly. But through sort of a long-term study that identified a small subset of women who, despite repeated exposure to HIV, remained HIV negative. And, it was more than just chance that they remained this way. So it was this thinking was that there's something about their biology that protects them from HIV. And so if we can understand that and induce it in other people, there's another tool in the toolbox to help protect people. And so this is a project that had been going on a long, long time before I began, and it's continued long after I've left. But for a period of time, there was a little ball bearing in the machine trying to answer some of those questions.
Quite a cool thing to be a part of.
Yeah, very much so.
Yeah, you really feel like you're making an impact, hopefully, in some way even.
Honoured to be part of that project for that time.
And did they ever work out, or have they got as far as working out what the variant is?
So I guess with lots of biological systems, it's possibly a combination of things, and that will vary between individuals. So,
right. Yeah.
A number of trends have been identified, which looks significant, but it's, again, probably in combination with a bunch of things.
Yeah.
And that whole research program and working with those communities, lots of other things have fallen out along the way that have been very helpful for the communities.
Yeah. And from my meticulous Google stalking of you, I saw that you actually got the opportunity to spend some time in Kenya as part of this project. That must have been pretty eye-opening and cool.
Yeah, very much so. Very much so. I guess it's some of my colleagues, some of the other people, spend a lot of time in Kenya, partly because either providing clinical support or they're working with samples that can't be transported. So there's strong research based in Nairobi. But I think it was also really important to understand that these are people, that it's not just a sample that comes, in a shipping container to work on. So that's all part of it, keeping perspective on what you're trying to achieve.
That's quite a cool thing to do, because often working in a lab environment, you're separated from the outcome. So to bring you into that space is a pretty cool and pretty cool thing to do.
Very special.
Do you get to travel as part of that, or a little bit of look around Kenya, or is it all just work?
Yeah, no. In fact, climb Mount Kenya, which is on the equator and it snows at the top. So
wow,
good stuff.
That's pretty cool.
Yeah.
So clearly not in Manitoba anymore. You're at PFR. What happens after the Manitoba postdoc?
So I guess I arrived in Canada with 20 kilos in a backpack, and then I left about not quite 7 years later with a Canadian wife, 3 Canadian children, and several pallet loads of furniture.
Wow, you did well, yeah.
Yes, very well. So my wife and I were married, and we had our children, and then we decided to move closer to family. We weren't living in the same city as her family, and fortunately Miriam was up for an adventure, so was prepared to come to New Zealand and give it a go for a couple of years. So we came back to New Zealand, and the thinking was that we'll see how it goes. And that was over 10 years ago.
Yep. And so did you jump straight into a job again, or?
No. So when we arrived, we had 5-month-old twins and a slightly older daughter that wasn't quite 2. So when we first arrived, I was the primary caregiver for the children, and my wife was working and keeping us in house and home. So that was my focus for the first quite a while. And PFR came along during that time.
Yeah, and sort of slowly transitioned you back from full-time dad to full-time worker.
That's the goal, yeah.
Very cool. Not enough people do that, I think. I think that's a good way to do it. From hearing you talk, I think in bee world, you'd be a worker bee, not a drone, as you're a pretty busy guy, because you're also a counsellor for the Matamata Piako Council. It's a big sort of juxtaposition. So how did that come about?
So I guess I thought about this a little bit coming up here today, and I think there's probably two things at play. One is that I did all my study in Wellington, and although I was doing science, it's Parliament's there, politicians spend a lot of time there. That's like the background noise. And this was the good old days when there was a new newspaper in the morning and a newspaper at night, and you'd catch up on who was juggling what balls at the time, and then you see Helen Clark at her favourite curry. And while I was studying science, a lot of my peers were, doing politics and law and policy. So I think probably out of all of that, I became intrigued by the process of being a politician, hawking your vision and hopefully winning elections and then making a change. And so I think probably from that, it probably made it onto the bucket list that it would be quite a good idea to go through an election process at some stage. Presumably fail miserably, but at least give it a go. But that was just in a holding pattern for a couple of decades. And then when I was at home with the kids in Matamata, and we did everything that the community had on offer that was appropriate for small children. And that's probably when I got a feel for, firstly, how significant volunteers are in having communities function well and what's on offer there in an unsung capacity. That's not why they're doing it, but it's just really important. And also the role that good governance, a well-run community can have. And so I guess it was seeing that and thinking it could be a way that I could make a contribution.
I guess the question that's on my mind is how hard is it to manage these two very different roles?
Who knows? I would say that's not a question for me to answer.
Okay,
that's for my team, and that's for the voters of Matamata Piaka.
Yeah, okay, yeah. Yeah, are you managing it? Would maybe be the question. Are there any skills that overlap between them, do you think, in terms of leading a science group and being immersed in local politics?
Yeah, absolutely. Firstly, like dealing with the material, and there's huge amounts of reading in both spaces. So just being okay with dealing with all of that and organising it in a way that makes sense is super helpful. And then also it's helpful to be able to analyse problems and identify solutions, and as a counsellor as well, hopefully, is the goal. There's also some things that are a little bit different. I guess in science, when we talk about ideas, we need rational support, essentially we can point to support our decision making, whereas I'd say in politics or in communities, there's other factors there that are not quite so easy to articulate, that are still significant and still have a huge impact, but I definitely can learn from some of my colleagues as to how to take those on board a bit more effectively.
Yeah, some of the more nuanced stuff must be.
Yeah.
Is that quite a challenge coming from a science background?
I don't know if it's a challenge, but there's definitely times where it's like, I don't know if I would have thought of that in the first instance, but good to. That's why we're part of a team. So
yeah,
we all bring different things.
Hopefully that could feed back to your role as team leader at PFR as well.
Absolutely.
Learning some of those softer skills, I guess, if you want to call it. A burning question from me is, as a Matamata counsellor, do you get free tickets to Hobbiton or a discount rate?
No, we don't. There is
special access to rooms we can't access.
I wish. Otherwise, we'd be doing that podcast here. But no.
Any aspirations to go further than kind of local body politics in terms of electorate MP, anything like that on the horizon?
Oh gosh, it's super inspiring to see what those roles what people can do in those roles, of course. But it would require a whole step change in terms of my commitment to being a politician. And I think for now, I'll just try and focus on being a very good team leader and a very good local body politician.
Just want to talk quickly about how you got elected. And you had some help from a brother, a very talented, is he younger or older brother? Younger brother, Tom. And I've seen the endorsement video he made for you. It's very good. Do you want to talk me through how that came about, whose idea it was, and if it helped or hindered you?
I'm positive it helped.
Absolutely, yeah.
And I would have asked him to do it for me. And he managed to find time in his schedule to put something together. So very much appreciated.
Yeah. If listeners haven't seen it, it's him and his character as, is it Fiona?
There was a Fiona one and a Paula Bennett one.
Oh, yeah. Okay. Yeah. Okay. I've only seen the Fiona one, but Google it and have a look at it. It's very clever. I actually thought science would make a great comedic material with some of the people that we work with, some of the somewhat eccentric characters. Maybe you should have thought about talking to Tom about maybe some material from the science world.
I feel
Some
like
new characters?
every time he's always collecting materials, so
You've got to be careful what you say,
yes,
I guess.
absolutely.
You might become a character one day.
I feel like if I become a character, I will have made it if I make it onto one of his character lists.
Okay, back to the serious stuff. You've had a really varied career, both inside science and also outside science, I guess, with your local body politics work. What would you say are you most proud of achieving so far?
Being a dad. But in the science and the politics space, oh gosh, I don't know. I guess like front of mind right now, because it's a role that I'm in at the moment, it would be when the team does well and achieve things and seeing their satisfaction in achieving things is very gratifying to see, both as individuals but also as a team.
Yeah. So just getting that satisfaction from that. And also, I guess, looking in science as it is today, I guess, would you still make the same decision to go into it if you were James Sainsbury 1992 versus James Sainsbury 2024 at secondary school?
Gosh, that is a very difficult, difficult question. I feel really happy with where I am at the moment. I feel really, privileged to have the opportunities that I have to work in science in this way. And so, how can I say that that's not a good thing? So I don't believe so.
Yeah.
But I guess I also like to look forward and what the other opportunities are that might come up ahead.
Yeah. So it sounds like you're in a pretty good place in terms of where you're at. Okay, and that seems like a good place to leave it and wrap it up. What has been a really engaging podcast. James, I'd like to thank you for coming on to Sigest and sharing just a little bit of your world.
Thank you, Andrew.
And I understand you're going to be doing some podcasting yourself down there in Ruakura.
Listen, Andrew, I couldn't possibly comment.
That's a great politician. So you're going to do well in politics. Okay, thanks everyone for listening. Don't forget to subscribe to Sigest wherever you get your podcasts. Mā te wā. See you next time on Sigest.